Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a fantastic day. My name is Kmart, and I want to talk about some basketball. And today, we are going to be talking about the Minnesota Timberwolves and how I believe they should address the current issue they have with the injury to Karl-Anthony Towns. Um, let's just sort of get right into it in case you missed it. The Timberwolves did announce recently that Karl-Anthony Towns had suffered a torn meniscus and that he would be undergoing surgery for that injury. The hopeful expectation, I guess we'll say, was that Towns could potentially return uh, as early as sometime in the early Western Conference playoffs, I think was the phrase. It's a little bit vague, but the idea is maybe somewhere in the first or second round of the playoffs, Towns could potentially return. In the meantime, though, the Timberwolves have to move forward with the rest of the regular season without one of their sort of star players here, in a situation that very much kind of mirrors what we saw earlier in the season with the Philadelphia 76ers and the injury to Joel Embiid. Now, the reason why I bring that scenario up is because it presents an interesting sort of dichotomy here. When Embiid went down, I think I made a video on it talking about how the 76ers basically needed to pivot, right? They needed to change their style of play because so much of how their team operated, at least on the offensive end, revolved around Embiid. They were built around Embiid. He was the focal point, and without him, there was no singular player that they could sort of plug in on that roster to get the same effect. For the Timberwolves here, despite having a similar sort of player in terms of position injured, the Timberwolves are not in that same situation. In fact, in my estimation, they're pretty much in the opposite situation. Rather than needing to change their style with Karl-Anthony Towns now injured, they really can't afford to. They need to remain the exact same team that they were before Towns was injured. Now, the reason why is because the Timberwolves are built differently compared to the 76ers. Sorry, had to do the joke, but the Timberwolves are built upon a foundation of basically two things that kind of play into each other, and that is an elite sort of level of physical defense and an offense that is slower significantly than the league average, but highly efficient. And those two things sort of feed into each other in a way that the Timberwolves at this point really can't afford to try and separate and change. So we'll start on the offensive side of the ball here, because that'll kind of drive the point home a little bit. If you look at Minnesota's offense just in terms of sheer volume, it's a little confusing because they are relatively low on the lists in a lot of major scoring categories. Taking a look at their offense prior to Towns' injury, they were 20th in the league in points, 25th in field goals per game, 30th in field goal attempts per game, 16th in three-pointers, and 25th in three-point attempts per game, while being 25th in the league in pace, which is effectively a measure of sort of your possessions, right? 16th was the highest that they had there, and that was in just total three-pointers made. Everything else was 20th or worse. So not a lot of shots taken by the Timberwolves compared to other teams in the league. So you might wonder, if they're taking so many fewer shots than other teams, how are they still one of the top squads in the Western Conference? And the answer is because the Timberwolves are unbelievably efficient. If you look at their percentages in terms of their shooting, things come into focus a little bit more, right? They are 10th in the league in field goal percentage, or were prior to Towns' injury. They were second in the league in three-point percentage. They made the 8th most free throws in the league, and they shot the 9th most free throws in terms of attempts. So this is the brand of basketball that the Timberwolves play. They slow the game down. They're 25th in the league in pace. They rely upon efficiency over volume. and they grind their opponents down a little bit with a physical style of play that came with both guys like Towns and Gobert down low and guys like Anthony Edwards with just insane levels of sort of athleticism, forcing a defense onto its heels and drawing a fair few number of fouls, right? 8th in the league in free throws made, 9th in free throw attempts. So they were, and frankly still are, getting to the line on top of their efficiency shooting from the field. Now, that style of play is much easier to do with a guy like Karl-Anthony Towns on the floor. He's 7 feet tall. He was taking 15.5 field goal attempts per game. He was shooting 5.6 three-pointers per game as well, included in that 15.5. And his percentages were pretty damn impressive. 50.6% from the field, 42.3% from three. So Towns played into the offensive efficiency for the Timberwolves. So now the question is, how do you replace that, right? Towns accounted for 20 plus points per game. You can't just redistribute those 15.5 field goal attempts amongst the rest of the roster and hope that they can score as many points as he did, right? Because the more guys you distribute those shots to, the more guys also need to maintain the level of efficiency that Towns presented, right? Guys like Mike Conley, Naz Reid, Jaden McDaniels, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Kyle Anderson, go up and down their lineup here. They'll all need to increase their scoring outputs, right? You do need to make up for the points that Towns now vacates via his injury, but you need to do so in a way that doesn't rock the boat in terms of Minnesota's style of offense. You still need to play that slower, more methodical, and more efficiency-focused style rather than just chucking up shots in the hope of, finding 20 plus more points per game amongst the 4 or 5 guys that I mentioned. And the reason why it becomes important for them to remain rooted in that offensive style is because, as I mentioned before, the offense and the defense are sort of built around each other, right? On the defensive end, Minnesota is frankly an elite squad, right? You take a look at their numbers. They're first in defensive rating, they're first in points allowed, first in field goals allowed, for first in field goal percentage against, and then they're top 5 in terms of 3-pointers made, 3-point attempts allowed per game, 3-point percentage allowed, rebounding, and assists allowed per game. So Minnesota is one of the stronger defensive teams in the league. And just like I mentioned that the sort of offense plays a physical style, the defense relies upon that even more so, right? The defense enforces the slower style of play that the offense is built around. Their defense is meant to punish faster, and I guess at this point, some people would potentially say stronger offenses than Minnesota that rely upon that volume, right? The defense isn't going to let a team going up against them take, 40 plus 3-pointers, or if they do allow it, it's because those 3-pointers are the only shots that the offense is going to get, right? So the physical brand of defense is something that Karl-Anthony Towns was a big factor in as well. So you will need to effectively replace him or attempt to do so. Now, the Timberwolves do have guys, at least size-wise, who can sort of help out on that front, right? They'll lean on Rudy Gobert first and foremost because he's still active, but guys like Naz Reid, guys like Garza, maybe even a mix of McDaniels and Anderson needing to occasionally play down a bit. I know they're kind of undersized to be a 5 instead of a 4, but you may need to do that when Gobert is not on the floor. But they will need to play that physical style of defense because the Timberwolves defense is part of why the offense can do what it does. The offense can play a slower pace and rely upon its efficiency because the defense forces the opposing team to play in a similar fashion, right? If the defense can't enforce the same pace on the opponents that your offense wants to play with, then the mismatch sort of becomes too much to handle. So, long story short, the Timberwolves really cannot afford to change, even with Karl-Anthony Towns gone. They need to trust in their backup players. They need to trust in their role players to collectively pick up the slack. On the offensive end, they can heavily lean on Anthony Edwards to sort of carry as much of the offense as possible, but they need to do so while remaining within their own system. They cannot afford to change. They can't become a fast-paced, up and down transition sort of team here, or just a team that, you know, chucks up a bunch of three-pointers like we've seen some other teams do, because then everything falls apart, right? Your defense is slow and physical, so is your offense. And you have built a roster full of guys who, frankly, are built to play that style. And by extension, maybe aren't suited to running up and down the court a bunch, right? Quite frankly, I'm sort of looking at Rudy Gobert in particular. We saw that even back in his days with Utah, where Utah would try to sort of play a little bit more up-tempo, and Gobert really did kind of look, I'm not going to say lost in that system, but noticeably less effective. And at times, the Jazz even sort of subbed him out and put in a smaller, sort of faster five to try and play that style. But you've got guys who are meant to be sort of slower and more physical. That is their game, and it works because the system was built to facilitate them. If you then try to change that system, you will be getting less out of those bigger, slower guys who anchor your defense. And if the Timberwolves lose their status as an elite defensive team, then the slow, efficient offense is going to be punished pretty heavily here, right? Because again, relying on efficiency only works when your opponent has to play the same game. If they don't have to play by those restrictions, Minnesota's scoring output is probably not going to be enough to win a lot of games, but we shall see, right? So far, it's been a bit of a strange process for the Timberwolves since Towns' injury. They've had a game or two where Gobert's not available as well, so that kind of contaminates our sample size ever so slightly, right? The game against the Lakers in particular, I think, is the big one. A lot of talk about, you know, how their defense would hold up against opposing big men, but they didn't really have Gobert in that scenario. So I don't know. We'll reserve judgment. There's only, 20 some odd games left in the season here, so even if the Timberwolves did want to change their style, I'm not sure there's enough time left in the season to even pull it off. So maybe that's even more incentive for them to try and stay the course here and just do what's been working for them until hopefully Towns returns. But feel free to let me know what you think. How do you believe the Timberwolves should address the Towns injury? Should they change? Should they just try and sort of keep things the same? Do you believe the Timberwolves will sort of slide out of maybe the top 2 or 3 in the Western Conference over the final few weeks of the season, or do you think that they can hold strong even without Karl-Anthony Towns and maintain a spot near the top of those standings? But either way, please feel free to let me know what you think. But other than that, thank you all so much for watching, and I will talk to you later.